Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first formal meeting of the Sustainability and Transport Overview Steering Committee. And I'm sorry we had this bad start because we need to make time off for it. Notice of coding of the webcast. It's a reminder to all members and staff that this meeting is being live streamed on the internet and subsequent broadcast, so please can we keep this in mind when speaking. The press and public can record, take photos if they wish, except where there are confidential or OBM items. Item 2 is important over our committee and chair. Item 2 is formally brought in one of members to this committee and chair. It's myself, and I think this way I think for the benefit of anybody watching the live stream and subsequent broadcasts, they could be together to introduce ourselves. I'm Councillor Chaman, so on duty to go to board, and I'm chair of the Sustainability and Transport Overview Steering Committee.
Councillor Richard Parkin, Sutton Redicap Ward.
Councillor Timothy Huxtable, Hall Green South Ward.
Levens, Assistant Director of Transport.
Councillor Liz Clements, Cabinet Member for Transport. Mel Jones, Head of Transport Planning and Network Strategy.
Councillor Colin Green, Shelby Ward.
Councillor Martin Brooks, Hull.
Councillor David Barker, Bramley Kings Heath Ward.
Councillor Alex Aitken, Kings Norton North.
Councillor Miranda Perks, William Hilliard Ward.
Thanks very much. And the agenda item 3 is election of Deputy Chair. Today we have confirmed the board of Deputy Chair to act up in my absence. And after now one nomination, we see Councillor David Parker. And are there any other nominations? And do we agree with the board of Deputy Chair of the committee to be David Parker?
Agree.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Now, item 4, policies. Are there any policies today? From memory and memory?
No.
Item 5 is declaration of interest. Can all members declare any interest now or before any relevant items? Please. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I have to declare my membership of the Transport Delivery Committee of the West Midlands Combined Authority, and on the TDC, I'm the Vice Chair and one of the Vice Chairs, and also the lead member for Rail and Metro. And that will be a continuing declaration for the rest of the municipal year.
Thank you. Any other declarations? No. I don't know, without declaring myself, I did put on the Commodity Authorities Transport Subcommittee, which is, I think, to go with my role. Okay. Terms of reference. This is to note the committee's remit has sat on the Constitution. That's for noting. Item 7 is active notes of last 4 meetings held on 15th, 16th of March and 28th of April. And my understanding is that it's only Councillor Timothy Huxtable, who is the current member, who was served on the previous committee. So can I ask you to look at this minutes for accuracy?
I'm very happy to confirm they are accurate, but I have a matter arising from the actions.
Right. Anybody else have any objections? Fine. So can you have the amendment right, please?
Thank you. Under page 8 of 64 on item 6 clean air zone baseline data, if I remember correctly, and officers will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, it was noted, as it is in here, that there was like a 13% reduction in air pollution levels within the COZ, But it was also reported that there was a 14% reduction in the ring along the ring road and a 13% reduction outside the ring road. So just to give you this complete picture, and I'm looking at officers and Councillor Clements, who's also there, just to confirm that my memory is correct on this.
I'll certainly recognise the 13%. It's a long time ago, that meeting. It sounds correct.
I think it's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's just the whole picture. Thank you, Chair.
All right. Anything else you want to raise? No. Not it is our current member. Current member, your previous meeting. So it's over to you. And so that's how you present your what.
Great, thanks, Councillor Law. It's lovely to see you in the chair of this committee, which obviously I have a lot of affection for, having been a member of this committee in its current format and its previous format for the last 5 years. And wonderful to see Basima and welcome to all the new members. And it's great to have a full, I think we've got a full house of councillors, full attendance today, which is great. And obviously, Councillor Huxtable has made a fantastic contribution on this committee and provides the continuity and I'd say the institutional memory and obviously the perspective of also having been the portfolio holder in the past. So thanks very much, Councillor Law, for agreeing to give some changes to agenda planning so that I could attend today and talk about my priorities. Because that's because in September I've actually been invited to go to the Netherlands to look at some cycling infrastructure, to look at how we could level up to the highest grade cycling infrastructure. So if I get my passport back, I will be doing that. And it's like my capital meeting in September. But it is really great to be here. I've got a team of my officers here to provide some expert commentary when we get into the questions and answers. So I've got quite a short presentation, which has been circulated in advance of the paper. So I'll move into that. And really, I suppose at the beginning of this new term of the council, it's useful to have this session to reiterate our big strategic priorities. And those are really captured in the Birmingham Transport Plan, which was adopted in October 2021. And again, I think that's the value of today, really, to introduce that plan to particularly to new members of the council who joined in May 2022, because I think this is an extremely ambitious plan, which is going to revolutionise the way that we move around in the city, and it's addressing a number of strategic issues. So we've listed them here on the slide. Obviously, P1 is addressing the climate emergency and decarbonising transport. Will be key in moving to a carbon neutral city by 2030 or as soon as possible thereafter, as a just transition allows, which is how we framed it in our Route to Zero action plan. On air quality, obviously we've already implemented the clean air zone, but now we need to look at how we push beyond that, beyond the compliance with the current legal limits, actually look at implementing the clean air strategy across the whole city. Obviously we're a growing city, and we want the economy to be flourishing, so we need to look at whether we've got a transport system which is fit for that growing economy and meeting the needs of everyone. And we want people to feel that they can invest here and set up businesses here with the transport system that will support them. There's a lot that we want to do in the plan on new technologies, looking at how we use data and innovation and ways to manage transport. And for all of us as local members, a very key element of the transport plan is about the action that we take at local level in all our local areas, and action on parking, road space allocation, but also levels of traffic in each of our wards. And just the final thing to say here is that all of this effort that we're making to transform transport in the city and what is part of the green and ecologically led recovery from the pandemic that we've been through. And you saw the pandemic, that horrendous period, and was actually a catalyst in some ways for action on active travel and promoting walking and cycling. And from my perspective, that's one of the few positive things that came out of that horrendous pandemic and the terrible loss of life. So I'll return to the active travel as a theme a bit later in this presentation. So onto this slide, which is just to reintroducing the key principles of the transport plan. Interesting change of language here, because in the document I remember them being called the big moves, but I think they're big principles that are driving our strategic thinking on transport. And so they're listed there. Reallocating road space, so making more space on our roads for mass transit buses, prioritising active travel in local neighbourhoods, walking and cycling, managing demand through parking measures, which is I think one of the things that's going to be extremely controversial in the, as we move forward, but we've got a lot to do there, and transforming the city centre. And in the blue box there, we just captured, if you like, the vision statement from the document. And I would just like to emphasise just how ambitious this document is. It's drawing on the best practice of a lot of other places, notably Ghent, I think. But there are other places like Barcelona, which are very much pushing forward on this sort of agenda, and we've much to learn from other places. But hopefully, in the future, we can be the sort of beacon the place that other places aspire to be like. So at the moment, we've got the strategic document, the transport plan. And it's setting out a vision and objectives, but we now need to focus on delivery. So there's work ongoing to identify key delivery projects. Decarbonising transport is the big driver, and again, decarbonising will also determine the priority of the projects. The delivery plan is currently in development. Officers can deal with more detailed questions on that. But obviously, as you're all aware, there are transport schemes that are currently ongoing, and they are all already being delivered in alignment with the Birmingham transport plan. So, and the delivery plan won't just be a set of projects; it will include measures on behavioural change, mode shift, and key performance indicators. Because I think we need to be sure that we're actually making a difference, and people's experience of moving around the city needs to be different, and it needs to be a city where it's much easier and safer to walk and cycle. So then, I've just mentioned walking and cycling. So this slide is really a lot of detail on our active travel ambitions. And for new councillors, it's worth pointing out that we've had for a number of years, I think since 2014, real action to push forward safety and attractiveness of cycling in Birmingham through the Birmingham Cycle Revolution. And I'd like to pay tribute to Victoria Quinn and the previous members of the predecessor committee that worked on a big scrutiny inquiry on cycling in early 2010s, because I think that provided the impetus for a lot of work that's been done on cycling. So really, I think we're going to be talking about Birmingham Cycle Revolution 2.0, a re-energising of the cycle revolution. I want us to push further, because I'm somebody who's recently taken up or got back into cycling during the pandemic, and I know that while we've got lots of good infrastructure that's been delivered already, this city is still not the safest, the most attractive place to cycle around. So we've delivered a lot already through the cycle revolution, but there's much more to do. So some of those elements will be the development and delivery of the A45 and A38 cycles at superhighways, development of further routes, including a city centre, Green Road Greenway. But it's very interesting. Last week I went up and looked at the Dudley Road highway infrastructure project, which obviously has been the subject of quite a lot of controversy in relation to some of the comments from cyclists around the city. But I say myself, I was really impressed in how that project is going to open up bus priority and cycle connections across the city. So from there, you'll be able to make connections back from over the Harbour Walkway and down to the south side of the city, and through across the city centre and through George Water. So I saw there something taking shape that was really exciting and really opened up the city to cycling. But we just need to keep up the emphasis there. We've got an image on the slide of a cycle hangar. So now we should push forward with a cycle hangar pilot. And at the moment, I'm actually looking at whether I can have a mentoring arrangement through the LGA with the cabinet member in the London Borough of Hackney, which I think is one of the boroughs that's gone furthest on street cycle hangars. So That's that hasn't yet been firmed up, but that's one of the reasons why I would like to have the mentoring from Hackney or Walton State to learn from places, other places in the country where they've really pursued some of these ambitions really relentlessly. And we'll be carrying on distributing the free bikes. That's one of the most heartwarming and amazing things that we've been doing through the Big Birmingham Bikes and Birmingham Cycle Revolution, which is giving away bikes to people who struggle possibly to buy them themselves. I went up to Hampstead Pavilion a couple of weeks ago and the latest of the bike giveaways. But those bikes have been funded through net surplus revenue from the Clean Air Zone. Again, so we're taking that surplus revenues that is generated from the Clean Air Zone and using it to do positive things to transform the transport system and active travel. So again, we need to keep pursuing those objectives. We're going to be continuing with the e-scooter trial and the West Midlands cycle hire scheme. Obviously, the West Midlands cycle hire scheme is an initiative of the Transport for West Midlands, but it's one that I fully support. And we urge you to try out those bikes if you can, the electric bikes, which I tried out, and that was a transformational experience. And I hope that that scheme will also be extended to e-cargo bikes, which will make a big difference. Start improving some of the delivery journeys we're going on in the city. In terms of the public realm in the city centre, I'm starting to develop a being my bonnet about pedestrianisation in the city centre. That's partly a product of the number of walkabouts that I've been engaged in over the last couple of months since taking up this role, and also I know that the council leader, Councillor Ward, is also interested in looking at how we can extend pedestrianisation in the city centre and improve cycling connections. Because again, if we're aspiring into competing with other big cities in Europe and in North America, I think we're finding that there are a much wider range of areas that are completely pedestrianised and where people are able to cycle in safety in the city centre. And then the final thing that I wanted to say about the active travel in the city centre is that the work on the city centre segments, which is probably part of the Birmingham Transport Plan, that is ongoing and is being delivered at the moment. And if there's any questions about that, officers can respond to those in the question and answer session. And I think we're all, as local councillors, aware of the casework that we get and the concerns that residents have got. And I certainly am constantly getting residents who are getting in touch about their concerns about speeding and road safety. So I want to take advantage of the fact that the road safety strategy is due to be refreshed, and that work starting now. I want that refresh to be driven by Vision Zero. Okay, so that's an approach which seeks to eliminate death and serious injury on our roads. Because although when we talked about this at the audit committee, I expressed shock, at the number of fatalities that they've been in the last few weeks in the city, and it was suggestion that that's probably a sort of normal level of accidents and fatalities on the road. To me, any death on the road is a tragedy. For the family and the loved ones and the friends of the person involved, and likewise with serious injury. And I think in this city we should be moving away from the ideas that the roads are places where you want like to fall victim to an accident which where you could be seriously injured or probably killed. So that's really the reason to emphasise Vision Zero as the thing that's going to be driving our work on road safety. Obviously, as we look at decarbonising the transport system, we need to make it possible for people to use electric vehicles. So we'll be focusing on the accessibility of electric vehicle charging, and the focus there will be on streets with no off-road parking, streets very much like the one that I live on, which has got terraced housing and a real, I have to say, battle all the time for parking space. I think that's is a huge challenge for Birmingham and most other cities really. We want to expand car sharing and car hire options, and also we've delivered many car-free school streets already in the city, but we're really, I want to see a big expansion of car-free school streets across the city. Again, that's addressing an issue that I'm sure all of you I guess in your casework emails about the parking chaos outside schools, and I know we corresponded with Councillor Parkin about possibilities in Sutton Newhall, and I'm aware that in Kings Heath, 2 new car-free streets have emerged from the development work on the Places for People initiative in Kings Heath. So I think that's just a hugely positive initiative, and really we're using again the net surplus revenue from the CAD to fund that work. So it's again a positive thing that's coming out of the clean air zone, making an impact from implementing the clean air zone in the city centre, making sure that there's an impact in our suburbs and neighbourhoods. And that, again, making the link to the clean air zone, we've got a big project to monitor air quality outside schools. And I think we've now, what we aim to do is have one school in every of the 69 wards engaged in monitoring air quality with their own air quality monitoring unit. And I think that at the last count we were probably up to about 54. A significant proportion of the wards have already got one school signed up, but if you haven't got a school in your ward engaged already, I would urge you to go out and recruit them. So at the moment, in my ward, I've got a senior school, but I'm very keen to get some of the primary schools involved as well, because I think trying to work parents on their understanding of the quality of the air outside the school and how that should influence or could influence their decisions about the method of transport that they use in the school run, that all seems to be really, really crucial and all really interconnected. I've already mentioned distributing more free bikes, but we also want to move towards developing community cycling hubs. But I think just making sure that everyone's got access to cycling, irrespective of their socioeconomic circumstances, is really, really important. Then that's what makes cycling a normal, safe, everyday activity, which you can do as a matter of course without having to get dressed up in special kit or being able to have your own very expensive bike. Okay, just moving on to public transport, and I think for me, the real excitement about being offered this role in Cabinet was the chance to have a platform to advocate for public transport, because I have lived in the city for over 20 years as a public transport user, because I can't drive, and I'm aware that we've got there's lots going for the public transport network in the city, but also lots that could be improved. Obviously, as a council, we don't deliver the public transport, so this is where our skills and capacity and partnership working really are absolutely crucial. Okay, so we will be working with Transport for the West Midlands to deliver cross-city bus routes and pushing on bus priority, because bus travel becomes attractive if you can move through traffic swiftly and without extensive delays and congestion. And I think when Councillor Zaffer, my predecessor in this role, oversaw a survey of customers or passengers' perceptions of bus travel in the city, it was actually the fear of having to sit for ages in bus in congestion in traffic jams. That was the biggest deterrent to bus travel. And interestingly, that was more of a deterrent to fares, although they were also an issue with the price of bus travel. And again, captured on the slide here, that our ambition, and it's something that was in a prominent position in the Labour manifesto, which is now the city, that is bringing all residents into 30-minute journey time of the city centre. So I think that's really important, because a lot of us know the residents in places like Longbridge or perhaps in King's Standing or something further out from the city centre feel that they are actually isolated and a long way from the city centre, and that tends to reinforce the perception that there's only development going on in the city centre, which is not true. But we need to open up new options to get quickly into the city centre without having to drive. And on that, we are dependent on the bus network. Buses are our mass transit system in Birmingham. We've got the emerging tram network, and it's great to see the tram running, but at the moment it's one line, and we've got development plans. But if you want to get across the city and actually make some connections, you need to go by bus. And I certainly will be urging officers across the city to travel by bus. Now I know that highways and transportation staff take buses, but when I go to other meetings with other parts of the council, I'm less sure who actually has experience in using public transport in the city. So yes, I absolutely want to drive forward with integrated public transport in the city and use our influence over the other actors in this space for delivering public transport. So although we haven't captured it on the slide, that will include engaging with local and regional rail matters. So I've actually taken up a place on the board of the West Midlands Rail Executive, and I'm on that board. I'm going to have a particular portfolio interest for customer experience, passenger experience on the rail, and that's something that I think that would be a useful way to exercise influence. There's a number of other rail developments that are going on at the moment. Obviously, the development of the Campbell stations, but also considerations of the other stations going out in different directions in the city, which we might want to discuss in the questions and answers. And also the question of how we're engaging with HS2 developments and how the opportunities of HS2, but also some of the threats to for example, cycling and walking connections in the city centre, depending on how HS2 is developed. So that's perhaps something we could get into after the presentation or future meeting. And then the final thing on this slide is something which I want to flag up as a major strategic priority, and that's carrying on and dynamising the work that we're doing on the workplace parking levy. And I think this is a way of providing a revenue stream so that we can invest in future public transport improvements. So I've talked at a number of points in this presentation about how we're using the net surplus revenue from the clean air zone to make really major changes and major improvements, and we need another source of revenue. And I just because of the sort of things I tend to follow on social media, look at what's happening in big European cities and Spain, Germany, Luxembourg, also some northern American cities, and look at the offer that's being made for free or heavily subsidised public transport. And at the moment, we are simply not in a position to do anything like that. We do not have the resources available to do it. We're actually our budgets are under pressure. So the workplace parking levy, to me, looks something we need to push forward on in order to meet the ambitions that we've got in the Birmingham Transport Plan and also in the regional strategic plans like the Local Transport Plan, which is the responsibility of the Transport for the West Midlands. But it's obviously something that's going to will involve a lot of consultation and is likely to generate a lot of controversy. But I think if we're going to deliver this bold and ambitious agenda that we've got in the Transport Plan, then we need the workplace parking levy. And again, we've got examples in not that far away in Nottingham where the workplace parking levy has allowed Nottingham to actually make some big transformational changes of the kind that we should aspire to with their trams and their investment in low emission or zero emission fleet in the bus company, which they still run because it's a small bus company. Okay. Just coming on then to the highways part of the portfolio, which I know is close to our hearts again as local members, because of the amount of casework we get about the standards and state of the roads and pavements, street lighting and street treating in our local areas. And I think if you talk to Councillor Ward, from his perspective as a council user, I think he's trying to minimise the number of potholes and tackling the backlog of potholes and road repairs is an absolute priority for him. I could say it's one of his sort of red lines, non-negotiable. So I'm very aware of that, as I'm aware of my performance will be under scrutiny as well. But obviously, the first thing to say about highways is that we're delivering the highways maintenance at the moment through a temporary arrangement with Kia, but that we're looking forward to the restructuring of the private finance initiative for highways. That negotiation is ongoing. and will be continuing until April 2023. But the PFI brings in £52 million of PFI credits every year, so it's a key part of our budget. So that is a real focus for officers to bring that to a successful conclusion currently. But as I've said, the focus is on tackling potholes and tackling the state of pavements. We'll be introducing street work permits to minimise the disruption to all road users. And we'll be looking at a last mile strategy for the delivery of goods, which will enable us to reduce peak hour deliveries in local centres. Curbside management strategy to ensure that curb space is allocated in a fair and efficient and sustainable way. And there's also a big project that's underway to digitise traffic regulation orders, which we may want to sort of get into in more detail after we've put from the officers. But the point of that is that it will allow us to move towards taking over the enforcement of moving traffic offences, which I think has been quite a big change and gives lots of scope to have more powers there. There's also something that Phil is going to talk about in a separate item at the end of this briefly, which is a revision of the street naming and numbering policy. I've been briefed about this. I think it's important that we're on top of this, because the way the streets are named is sometimes seems to attract negative publicity for Birmingham, whereas actually the policy I think we've got is a very good and robust policy which allows us to reflect the history and the heritage of our city in a really, really positive way. So I've certainly been proud of the number of streets in the redeveloped Celio Hospital site in my own ward that reflect the history of the local area and honour the memory of some famous women and key medical professionals who worked on the site, and also some famous authors and poets who have worked at the university. So I'm very much in favour of that. And I think it's great to honour the contribution of people who've been really influential in Birmingham. Okay, I've got to the end of the slides. I'm very aware that this presentation hasn't covered one of the other key areas of my portfolio, which is flood risk management. But suffice to say that that's another area which I have repatriated to myself. Under my predecessor, who had worked with Alderman Tony Kennedy, who was covering a lot of those responsibilities, but I decided that I want to deal with that directly myself. So thank Alderman Tony Kennedy for his contribution, but I think given the importance of flood risk management for the city, but also in terms of its importance for climate change adaptation, I think it's important that it's part of the portfolio. Okay, that's the end of what I want to say. And so I hope to say
Thank you. Right, members, questions? Yes.
I just a quick question about the e-scooters and extending the trial. I was just wondering if that will kind of carry on in its current form, or if it will be adapted in any way. So I think some of the sort of like teething problems have been a bit more ironed out in terms of where they were left. Was a big one. And just also wondering if there were any plans to extend that to the south of the city, as it kind of cuts up around Sturtley, I think.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to the officers in a minute. But on e-scooters, I mean, I have been quite sceptical about them, but I am now coming around to them because I understand that they are making a big contribution to mode shift, and that they are allowing people to substitute for car journeys. I think that there are some quite interesting stats. I think it's about a third of people using them that otherwise have travelled by car. But I think that there will be an extension and a renegotiation of the contract, but I think that we need to ensure that the feedback that we've got about where they're left with the needs of people with visual impairments, and the interaction of scooters with other users of the pavement, that all of that needs to be taken on board. But I think that the pilot details, I'm going to hand over to Phil to fill in on that.
Yeah, thank you, Member. So yeah, very briefly on the e-scooters, the proposal for the tech report versus Cabinet in September, actually on the plan, which is to extend the period firstly of the trial, but then in parallel working led by the combined authority TFWM, it's actually not actually re-procure, but it's to do a brand new procurement of a new operator. Could be the same operator, that's their notification process. As Councillor Aiken was saying, picking up on some of those lessons learned about scooters, docking, can those not be on the pavement, for instance? That's just one of the many factors that we're going to build into that contract. So in terms of the specification, I'm not sure if the Cabinet members have seen it yet, but there is a draft specification that we're inputting into to make sure we have a materials we're going to go out with, meets all our requirements in the city and captures all the issues that obviously members, but also residents and other interested groups, disability groups, etc. picked up. So we're very much looking for enhanced operation. I think to say the pilot in Birmingham has been very successful. We pushed it the hardest in the region. You know, there's been trials in West Bromwich, one route in Coventry. You know, other districts perhaps haven't been so keen. So I think the focus will be on Birmingham and what we want so that we procure.
Before I bring the consultant to the my feeling is that the e-scooters were government buying for us and they want to accelerate it. So he's got still the governor is up to us now, whether we want to keep the e-scooter power and send it, or it's still in the hand of the government.
Yes, the trial is enabled through the government. And what governments are still looking at, and trials around the country have started at different times. So we were quite an early start in this region. Areas, including actually London, will be much later. So DFT, I'll take a little bit more time to public transport driving, and looking at all the feedback from all the various pilots across the country to then help shape legislation that needs to be put in place to make this a permanent feature. So in the interim period, they're going to extend these pilots and they're just doing full governance council level to enable that to happen. It needs amended or new government legislation, and I won't go into the technicalities, but you know, there's issues as Cabinet Member Mel know about things like cycle lanes and cycle tracks, but these traffic regulation orders, so that there are mechanics and that needs to be sorted through legislation.
Thank you very much. And can I thank the Cabinet member for setting out so early in her new portfolio her transport priorities in this format. So thank you very much. And first of all, the positives, and no criticism of Councillor Sattler at all, but it's nice to see that not only flooding is being repatriated, but as I understand it well, has also been repatriated. Obviously, we're well aware that Councillor Stacey, former Councillor Stacey, is very well. But it's nice to see it being taken back into the portfolio.
Can I just interject? I'm not able to cut it too long, but just to say now, we absolutely thank Councillor Stacey and Honourable Kennedy for their contribution. But I think that the fact to note is that my portfolio is changed in its scope, whereas Councillor Zaffa is looking at the environmental issues and response to climate change, which obviously is a massive agenda. That's now Councillor Majid. So that has opened up the headspace and work for me to really engage with the rail and flood risk management.
And again, hence why I said no criticism on Councillor Zaffa.
No, I was just
yes.
to reiterate that myself.
Yes, okay, and that's all very positive. I'm going to concentrate on questions regarding local level because I know the Cabinet member Capital Works, looked after by Phil and his department. Are we likely to see something similar this financial year or in future financial years? Is going to be my first question. My second question is, you talked about net surplus revenue from the clean air zone. In the very initial Cabinet report introducing and setting up the clean air zones, there was talk about devolving some of the net surplus revenue funding to wards. if I recall correctly, it's going to be £20,000 per year to each single member ward and £40,000 per year to each dual member ward. Again, where are we in terms of that initial proposal, and when are we likely, if at all, to see that money for schemes that meet the criteria of the Clean Air Zone being introduced in all the wards across the whole city? Because, as I think we all agree on, clean air is a right for the citizens of all of Birmingham, not just the Clean Air Zone. And the other thing is where there is need for carriageway modification requests at local level, because as local members we know what new infrastructure works best. So, for example, where there's a ponding issue, the installation of new road gullies to drain that water away, or where concrete bollards keep on being knocked down and double curbing would actually be the engineering solution to replace those bollards, which would obviously save on maintenance as well, looking at Kevin on screen in particular. Why these carriageway modification requests take so long to actually go through the system, and once they've gone through the system, so long to actually be installed in our local wards. As I say, when we know what would actually work locally. Yes, I know the list goes on. Right? Birmingham Cycle Revolution. I always point out that a lot of stuff was happening even before the Birmingham Cycle Revolution, like the local sustainable transport funding buying scheme up in City Coalfield in North Birmingham, like the major LSTF scheme and low carbon corridors by the ITA Centro, in terms of investment into cycling. And it's nice to see that work going forward, and I would encourage further partnerships with the Canals and Rivers Trust as well, who I know have played an important part in the cycling infrastructure within Birmingham. So it's not just the City Council, as I think you really want to have, it's our partners as well. And two more, air quality. Could you let me know which wards, which schools in those wards have signed up already? Because we don't, unless we go to each school individually and say, have you signed up for this? We don't know which schools to actually approach. So if that could be circulated, I'd be very grateful. And the final thing is, you have now given me a great question to ask every officer when they come to my board. How did you get here, Sharon? Can I just say that the person working on my All Green Urban Centre framework always does travel by public transport and the train, and then walks from train stations to the meeting venues. So there's a big tick there for Andrew Lindon. So shout out. And it is a great question for other officers when they actually attend my ward and other meetings. So I'm sure Phil will feed that through and Kevin to their officers. Thank you very much.
Yes, at the risk of embarrassing Andrew Lindon, Gold Star, with whom I've been corresponding with him because he's doing some work on healthy neighbourhood pilot, which is really essentially looking at possibilities for 15-minute neighbourhoods, which is another we need to look at as well. But I really welcome anybody who's using public transport to go about their business for the council, and so it'd be great to hear that officers are doing that. I actually thought on Sunday evening, the leader, myself and Phil went up to Perry-Barr, went up to the Alexander Stadium on the shuttle bus to test out all of the transport arrangements, the access arrangements, and I thought this is going to be a real opportunity because they're very good high quality buses that are travelling up there. The one that we got on obviously come from somewhere in South Yorkshire because it had destinations like Matlock and Sheffield in there. But for some people that will probably be the first time that they've taken a bus since they were at school, or for some of them it might literally be the first time they've been on a bus. So I think there's actually going to be a good awareness thing from the shuttle buses that are going up and down to the different Commonwealth Games venues in terms of raising people's awareness of public transport and challenging some of their prejudices about it. So I think we've got a real job there to make the bus network we've got in the city attractive, and a first option of choice when you need to move around the city. So I'm trying to remember what you just asked me. Actually, no, I'm now having a sort of brain. No, well, I've had some things. I said on the local improvement budget. I think we had, as colleagues will all know, full council. July's full council a couple of weeks ago had a number of questions about the local improvement budget, and we gave a list of the projects that were improving it for the previous year of it. And at the moment, I think I'm looking at that because it may be in the context of the refresh of the road strategy, the road safety strategy, that we morph into a road safety initiative, but with that local element. It's going back to me now. Sorry, it's just intense concentration on the local funding from the Clean Air Net Service Revenue. I'd very much like to pursue that, and I think Phil can answer the question about how far we've got with that. But I think that we need to give local members as much scope as possible to take local initiatives on road safety and on clean air. Because at the moment you've got you've all got access to the ward minor transport measures to do some minor highways improvements. But I think that opening up that local fund from the CAS revenue would actually allow much more potential for some good partnership projects at local level involving schools, community groups, and a real push on getting people to consider how their daily decisions about how they travel affects air quality. So yes, I'm very committed to seeing that rolled out at local level. So that's the first two questions. What was the next one?
It's around the highway modifications lines that you.
Okay, I think that's one for Kevin. I can see Kevin's there on the screen. So.
Yeah, I think, and so the sound's not great there, but I think the question was just around about the amount of time it takes to deliver them, Councillor Huxtable, was it, in terms of the local highway capital measures?
Yeah, well, no, not in terms of the, yes, first of all, getting them approved, and then once approved, getting them delivered.
Yeah, and I think that has been a bit more tested, I think, in the last sort of 12 months, 2 years, and probably for three reasons. I mean, getting them approved is we do have a fairly robust governance process, and goes back to one of the points you made there as well. We've got it's called the Transport and Highways Board that me and Phil chair, where everything that's going to go on the highway goes through that clearance process to ensure, in particular, that we've got the revenue consequences of those things covered off and accounted for, which is obviously an area of practice perhaps historically we haven't excelled at as a city. So yeah, there is a bit more governance around it, but I think it's done in the right way. Hopefully it shouldn't hold it up too much. It's a fairly slick process. We meet every 2 weeks. So in terms of getting the approvals, it shouldn't be that onerous. I think the other two things, yeah, I mean, obviously we have had draws in the last 12 months, particularly on other work programs, and then the local engineers that deliver these schemes. Again, some of those draws have been around delivering works to the Commonwealth Games. Previous year to that, it was around previous to last year, it was around obviously things like reopening the high street after COVID. So that we do have quite a draw on what's a fairly limited resource in the local engineering service as well to deliver those things. And I think finally what has become perhaps a bit more apparent, as I probably post COVID, has just been the ability to be able to access the contractor workforce or chain, if you like. That's other big projects, things like, and it does filter down through the whole contractor workforce chain. Things like HS2 taking a big draw on contractors. And even then down to a local level in terms of subcontractors and subcontractors, we have found it more difficult to get sort of timely commitments from contractors and local contractors to do that, because we are keen again to drive a lot of that small work through local SMEs and local contractors as well. So yeah, it can get drawn out a little bit, and I think the last couple of years has, as I say, thrown up a few challenges for that. But again, as far as we're concerned, we spend the budget that they're allocated where members identify what they want spent. So, but yeah, we'll take that and we'll see if we can get that process slicker. But I think we're fairly content. We're doing it as quickly as we can with the resources we have available.
Yes, I want to come back on this one because when I have walkabouts and site visits with officers from Kia, they tell me a different story. Now, recognising there are two sides to every coin and everyone has their own different perspective, they are telling me they are frustrated with the length of time it is for these carriageway modification requests, one, to be signed off, and two, to actually be implemented, because I keep on having a go at them, believe it or not, why the works that they tell me are absolutely necessary haven't been done. So I've obviously got individual ward-based issues myself, which I will feed back outside this meeting in a few minutes. But if it's a problem in my ward, I'm sure it's a problem across the whole city. And if they're expressing their frustration in the process, they can't be the only people who are frustrated with the process.
Okay. I'm not sure I'm getting that frustration from across the city, but again, as ever, Councillor Huxtable, as you say, happy to take on any individual examples you've got, and I'll look into those for you.
Thank you.
Right. That's it.
There were some other questions that Tim had raised. I think so there was you'd asked about the list of schools that are participating in the air quality monitoring project. I think it's 54, I think that was 69 wards where a school has already signed up, but we can get the list from Steve Arnold will provide that. I think that's a really great initiative. And then on cycling, I think the general thrust of your question was about how we can work with other partners to promote cycling time. And
I think it was recognising that work went before the Birmingham cycle revolution, and because you say the change in gear report under this process committee was a revolutionary step from council, but recognising the work that went on beforehand, because a lot of work did go on beforehand, thanks to my officers, not just from the council, but also the central ITA, but also working with other partners.
Absolutely, and I've met recently with Sustrans because I think obviously because the network of national cycle routes, and I get working with them and using their expertise is absolutely key. I think anything that we can do to get people cycling to sign up, to understand the strategic priority of cycling.
We've got very heavy level of this. It could be briefly.
Okay.
We have a few more questions. Can I bring in, I think, David?
I say Benjamin go first.
No, what?
I don't want to go just.
Okay.
Sorry.
I've just got big red ball.
I got one thing.
Martin, you will maybe.
Okay. Can I first of all thank Councillor Clements for a very clear presentation on active travel and also some very serious commitments. Obviously, you mentioned the strategic blue routes and the importance of those. Can I ask what thoughts you're giving about how we might connect large communities up to those routes? I'm not making any special pleading for Harborne, but it is an important one in that between Harborne and the blue route, it's also the QE hospital and the university. QE, several thousand employees. So, those could be quite important routes in terms of getting people onto those strategic highways. Just one, I'm slightly cautious about comments about the Harborne Walkway, for instance, and I know Councillor Huxtable mentioned the Canals and Rivers Trust. For me, these are primarily walking routes, and although I cycle on the canal towpath sometimes, and also on the walkway, but I think we need to be a little bit cautious about the use of those because there are plenty of people walking on those routes. Now, I don't want them to become dominated by people cycling. The other point I just want to make, I think we need, as a council, to use the opportunities that come up. For instance, and this is before I was elected, Harborne, and I'm not referring specifically to Harborne, just giving this as an example. The high street was there were the parking restrictions on the high street. The pedestrian footpaths were widened because of COVID to enable people to have more space. That was all taken away. The highway on the high street was resurfaced, and I think I'm not being critical, but I think people should look at what opportunities come about in terms of that kind of work going on. I'm not suggesting that every bit of resurfacing we should be putting in the cycleway because we're doing the resurfacing, but I think we do need to think about strategic centres, particular highways, and how we actually use what we're doing to further our commitments on active travel. Thanks.
After this, can you understand or?
Yeah, there were three things there. There was that connecting up the blue route in the blue routes to other cycle routes to allow people to access big employment sites like the hospital and the university campus. I mean, I think the whole drive of having the A38 blue route was precisely to allow people to commute to work. So thinking about how people are getting there from other directions as well is really important. And I know that you, Councillor Brooks and Councillor Francis and Quinton councillors are already engaging with local residents who are very concerned about that too. So I think that we need to sort of listen to the feedback that's coming back from the residents and look at in future what we can do to meet some of those aspirations. Obviously, they will depend on resources and having a strategic plan. I agree with you that canal towpaths and the Harbour Walkway, they're not cycle infrastructure, but at the moment, given what it's like to cycle around Birmingham, they are available routes for cycling. So at the moment, I am commuting by bike on the towpath most days, because that's at the moment, because even though the A38 blue is fantastic, I still find it more pleasant to cycle along the canal than to cycle along the middle of the A38 because of the level of pollution and the level of cars. But obviously in the evening I would choose the blue route because that's safe. I wouldn't, as a woman on my own, cycle along the canal after dusk. So I think that they're not canals and routes through parks, and they're not a substitute for high quality cycle infrastructure. And I think the officers have already experienced that if there's an option to go for the highest quality cycle infrastructure, that's what I'm going to ask for. But obviously, it's all got to be within the available resources and what's deliverable. Because I've really said it probably explicitly enough. We've gone through a phase where officers have been working at a level of intensity because of the active travel, emergency active travel response to the pandemic, and then the whole Commonwealth Games delivery. I mean, I've been so absolutely impressed with the amount of work that's gone on and the big highway infrastructure schemes that had to be completed to quite a mad timetable in order to be ready for the Commonwealth Games. I mean, the amount of effort that's gone into all of that is huge, and I'm aware that that's been a big pressure on all of our staff. We need to look at making sure that people don't just experience burnout now after the Commonwealth Games. So sorry, I know that I'm there was one other thing. Was there a third thing that you asked me? So there was linking up cycle networks, canals, and if Alcohol or action.
Cameron, I think it's Brooks suggestions to improve connectivity between major cycling areas where cycling would be great.
Oh, I know it was your active travel measures on Harbour High Street. I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely regret their demise. But but again, it's a question of working with the businesses and the local residents on what they want to see in the local area. But for me, a local centre that's pedestrianised and has got really good public transport options and options for walking and cycling is more attractive, and in the end will probably generate much more footfall. So that's very much what I'd like to see. But obviously, you and Councillor Francis are the local members as the Harbour, but the key role there to sort of be the catalyst for change there.
I wasn't making a special plea. It was
No,
about.
that would be an appropriate on the scrutiny committee because of what they
Yeah, just really quickly, Chair, thank you. So just following on from Councillor Waters' point, so we are in the process, approved a report last week, just to update our local walking and cycling strategy. So that's the overall plan. And just at the end of the previous administration, we took a report to Cabinet, it's probably Councillor Waters will remember, to invest another £1 million in terms of developing the cycle network. So as Councillor Clement says, we have been all at it, the COVID and Commonwealth Games, etc. And just trying to research a little bit more plans. And just on the point on alignments, we have a highways maintenance programme, an approved transportation and highways capital programme. So myself and Kevin, I think the challenge there is to try and get that a little bit more aligned. No, at times it's difficult because work's actually done, there's an emergency, etc. there and now. If we can get that alignment, I think it's really good.
Okay, I'll bring in Randy to comment for that.
Go for it.
Yes, I just have a few queries really, probably just response, and I don't know whether you can answer these now or whether it's too late. So mine are queries about Vision Zero approach to road safety management. What exactly does that actually mean? Is there, with this kind of new approach or this particular vision, to mean that there is additional funding coming from somewhere to fund this kind of new initiative or approach? Because I am aware that previously when you've raised issues of trying to get speed bumps or restrictions, it can't be done because there is particular funding. So I just wondered whether, if it is this particular approach is going to be taken, does that mean that there is additional funding coming from somewhere to help us do that? Might well be, you can't respond now and respond later. The other point is about the car-free school streets. So I'm just trying to understand whether there is a fundamental difference between car-free school streets and then just traffic management and safety at school pick-up and drop-up times. I'm not quite clear how those interact, because I appreciate that, yes, in an ideal world, we want to, children just to walk or cycle to school. But I'm also acutely aware that at the moment, with our current public transport structure, it is not necessarily easy for parents to actually use public transport or to walk, because they then have to potentially drop their kids off at different school locations, or they have to get to work themselves and they have to use the car. And I fully admit that this is something that we do as well because of time pressures. So is there a separate strategy then where you are, okay, well, we're looking at trying to cut down, and then we can help schools do that and provide them with assistance? But then is there an alternative route that is not necessarily all about restricting cars and saying we don't want cars at all, but just looking at a sensible way of traffic management at school pick-up and drop-off time, so that the schools are happy, kids are safe, but also residents, because I think that's where we get it. And it's slightly a different point really about kind of the traffic management and looking at, okay, well, maybe at pick-up and drop-off times we have one-way systems in place or pressing up. So I just want to understand the difference between those two. And I think in terms of, the last one, the public transport and partnership, completely appreciate the kind of predicament we're in, and the fact that we don't actually have control over the buses and to be able to decide what routes. I think the idea that bringing all residents to an accessible 30-minute public transport journey in the city centre, that doesn't necessarily take account of the fact that it's connecting different communities. And so I think that what is the strategy there, because it's not necessarily all about getting in and out of the city centre, it is getting across the city or across the south of the city, across the north of the city, but connecting the local communities. So, thanks.
Can I brief comment here?
Sorry.
But just for my own benefit, so there was a question about the 30-minute journey to city centre, car free school streets, and Vision Zero. So perhaps in reverse order. The commitment to make sure that every neighbourhood of the city is within 30 minutes of the city centre was as I said, a headline in the Labour manifesto, which we as Labour councillors are electing on. So we are going to sort of on that, but that's we feel like that's in a sense reflects the reality of what Birmingham's like at the moment. The planning has been about journeys into the city centre. So at the moment we're focusing on that, but I am deeply and painfully aware of how long it takes to travel from suburb to suburb, because I do that a lot without a car, and I have done things like trying to be a candidate in the Euro election across the region and trying to travel from Bourneville to Stourbridge or Walsall, and I know exactly how long those connections take. But I think we've got to start somewhere, and I think that the interconnection of neighbourhoods is also very important, and that's when we talk about an integrated public transport network. That is what we mean. That you can have journeys where you use different modes of public transport and you can go quickly and efficiently to wherever you need to go. That is what I experienced when I lived in Hamburg and when I go to Berlin or I go to Lyon. So that's why I bang on about it all the time, because it's achievable in other places, and most parts of Greater London that have got access to the tube network have got that experience. So it's absolutely lacking in Birmingham. So we need to not limit our ambitions, but saying everywhere will be within 30 minutes of the city centre is a start, and it's something that's easy to understand. So, for example, I think across the region, we should be saying things like we want a London-style integrated public transport network, because most people will have gone to London at some point, and that gives them a concrete picture of what we're talking about. Otherwise, it's too abstract. And for some people who think that the public transport is so inferior that they never use it, they can be completely deterred. Whereas I think saying you can get into the city centre in 30 minutes is a good commitment, because you could start on a bus outside Longridge bus station in the traffic in peak hours, and it would take you an hour or an hour and a half. I tried to commute my bus on Pershore Road at 45 for a long time, and it was extremely time consuming. So that's the first thing. On car free school streets, I'm absolutely hardline on this now. We are trying. We want all the schools to sign up to Mode Shift Stars, start to develop a sustainable travel plan, and look at what the options are for not driving to school. Because the thing for me that's absolutely frustrating with my own casework is that people will contact you and talk about the traffic chaos outside of the school. And I understand, and I've had conversations with a number of colleagues in the Labour group we've got, particularly primary age children in different schools. If you're working, you've got to get to school by a certain time, and you've got to get to your own work by a certain time. I understand the pressures. There's a colleague in the group, Councillor Era, who I talked to, who's a teacher herself, so she has to drop off 3 children and then get to school to be able to gain at another school. But every time somebody takes an individual decision to get their car out and drive to the school, we get to the system, to the state of congestion and air pollution outside the school. So the car-free school street is stopping people driving in at school starting time and at the end of school, and it's to promote behavioural change and to get people to look at what is practical within their lives to try and change the scene outside schools. But I'm sure that everybody here who's a local councillor in their ward has got a really difficult school. I know Tim's got the school that's in is it Chilcot Primary School, and again, Tim was one of the key advocates for this car-free school street scheme, which he'd seen operating in Solihull. So we've looked at the best practice elsewhere, and we're really pushing that. And then on Vision Zero, I think it is literally trying to push for zero, no deaths or serious accidents on the road, and it's heavily influenced by what happened in the Netherlands in the 70s. I think Dutch society reached a consensus about not wanting to see children in particular falling victim to road accidents. Now how we get there that's the difficult bit, and the resources are also the difficult bit. So you've already experienced that. I know you've been involved in the discussions about what could be done on Bristol Road to try and make it safer for kids going to the University of Birmingham school. But I think we need to move away from this idea that several people are being killed every year on the roads. I just find that horrific. In the past, there have been several fatalities, and each one of them is a tragedy for the family and the friends involved. And I think Phil was just prompting me, we need to start thinking about what we're doing at local level as a package. So there are things that we're going to fund through the net surplus revenue from the Clean Air Zone, which would be things like the car-free school streets, the air quality monitoring, but also further work on things like places for people, local neighbourhoods, all of that stuff, so that every local neighbourhood becomes a place where there's good air quality, it's safe to walk and cycle, and also that if you need to drive, then you can actually drive more easily because there will be less congestion. Because we're saying, look, what is the most efficient way to move around? If you need to use the car because you've got a complex journey to drop off several children to get to work yourself, then the car may be the best tool for the job. But for many journeys, it isn't. And each time someone makes a decision to get their car out to do a short local journey in a neighbourhood, they're just creating. We're all every time we do that, or when I get in a taxi, we're all contributing to the congestion, which is causing the city to grind to a halt. So I think we have to start being more hard on this, because we are trying to deter people from doing short, non-essential journeys through their localities and doing that sort of rat running and through journeys, which they could easily do on foot or by bike.
Right. Thank you, Cameron. Do you agree with that?
Thank you, Joe. And thank you for coming and as well. Just a couple of notes. I just want to say I have, like many people, had dealings with Boy over the East Coast scene, and really the only issue is people abandon leftovers. I've contacted Boy many times, and they've just been disinterested in resolving the issue. But I do think if that were cracked, actually, it would be pretty universally liked. On school streets as well, I was going to mention that I have St Dunstan's Primary in my school and my ward on Drayton Road, and I was speaking to residents, I think last week about this. Now, it was announced just before the election with a notice, and that wasn't really appreciated. And there are issues there with communication with the school, but it is overwhelmingly positive because it solves the issue of most children live within, the vast majority within a mile of the school, so they can walk. And the residents are saying it's now meant that there aren't sort of arguments and fights outside the school at pick up and drop off time, because it isn't physically the space to have cars going past each other. So I was surprised at how popular it's been, but it has really worked. And again, it's only for half an hour outside, so if people have complex journeys, they can try and run around that. What I wanted to ask was, what can we offer schools when we contact them about air quality monitors? Like, are we paying for the monitors? Is there any kind of incentive we have? And also, I would appreciate, again, being told which schools have signed up. Is that something we're going to tell every councillor, or just the ones in this committee? I think it might be useful to tell all of them. And the two other questions. One was, are there any plans to expand the clean air zone or expand upon it, because it seems to be a success? And the final question is, if we can figure it, you've spoken about pedestrianising more of the city centre, more of the city. I want to know if there's any update on pedestrianising parts of the gay village. To get who don't know, there's a push for this because most, to my knowledge, of the hate crime has been drive-by. So there's a theory that if we pedestrianise more of it, it actually is a safety issue that we can resolve. That's it.
Okay, just quickly, because I know Sharon will be keen to move down. I'm just thinking back into my previous chair role. Well, on the boy scooters, each time I've asked about that, and I think I've had lots of reassurances from here that boy staff do come out quickly and remove scooters if you report them. And I have actually seen some instances of that, because I've reported a number of them that have been just dumped on the A38 cycle route, and I've seen boy operatives come out and remove them quite quickly. But I mean, it is an ongoing irritation, because everywhere I go, I just see them sort of just left haphazardly. So thank you for the feedback about the car-free school streets, which is the two that have emerged as a result of the ongoing consultation and engagement in community. It's good to get that feedback. On the list of schools, I think before the election, an appeal had gone out to all members to try and engage with their own schools to get candidate schools to put themselves forward. So there's no intention to exclude anybody. We want to include every ward and potentially every school. And I think that it will be interesting to schools, because they can integrate it into science curriculum, and you can have some interesting activities and work in class time with it. But also, it's a way of raising awareness, hopefully, amongst parents about the level of pollution that there is around the school site. On the whether Can you just comment briefly on the funding? Presumably that the costs in having a monitor, that's covered.
Yeah,
by
we the council figure that out.
And then on the clean air zone, obviously, this committee, you know, before the elections has looked in quite a lot of detail at the clean air strategy, because that is the wider strategy document for the whole of the city. And at the moment, as far as I know, there's no plan to extend the clean air zone itself, but we clearly need to take action in every neighbourhood, you know, to address poor air quality, because there is really no problem that has clean air, and the World Health Organization has told us that there is no such thing as a safe level of air pollution. So we need to go further and faster to tackle air pollution.
Okay, quickly,
And pedestrianisation, well, the commitment's already been made on pedestrianisation in the Gay Quarter, South Side, and we've got a meeting to discuss that. But certainly, if you talk to Councillor Cotton from his community safety perspective, he's already made a commitment on that, and I'm fully engaged on it as well. But as I said, I think there are many other parts of the city centre which, you know, where, you know, pedestrianisation needs to be extended or completed. So, for example, I never really understand why they're still on New Street, you know, where cars are going around. But I know it's to do with the location of some car parks. But at the moment, I've just been up down there today and seen the number of visitors who come in, who are visiting the city with, you know, Commonwealth Games, and I think that they're sometimes taken aback when their car suddenly comes up behind them. But in the Gay Village, that is a commitment, and that we will work on that.
okay, so that's good news for you. Right.
My question is going to be answered by Councillor Marks. Okay.
You're okay. Okay, last bit.
That's one. Okay,
Last one.
quickly, this is in praise of the officers and talking about alignment. Don't fall down bridge. Those officers who were around at the time, I know Kevin definitely was, I think Phil was as well. It was a PFI infrastructure thing, and we aligned it with a safe route scheme, flood management, and upgrading the infrastructure on National Cycle Route 5, all in one scheme, done under the PFI. So it can be done, it actually has been done.
Okay.
Vigorous funding from Kevin.
Okay, you're quickly, very long.
No, just to say, now I agree with Councillor Huxtable. It's a good example of how we can all work and be tied up together. And as Phil said, I think earlier, the more that we can do, the better. But it's just aligning all those things when they come together.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. We move on to next item. Is 9 street naming and numbering policies. Can we have the papers? Very briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the slides have gone round. This is actually
no slides.
Yeah, no, I won't do. I'll just talk very briefly on it. It's actually a very specialist area. And I'm not a specialist in street naming and numbering, but I work with it. So this policy and change to the policy was circulated and quite new in the new municipal year, so the consultation did go out to all members and more broadly. But just looking at the feedback, I was quite conscious we didn't, probably due to the time of year, get that many responses. And as the Cabinet member was saying earlier, we are looking to take that report to Cabinet in September. So I think really, Chair, through you, I was just going to invite members, if they wish, to round table, if they perhaps didn't see the policy consultation, for good reason, just after the elections, if there were any kind of comments that members would like to feed back to me or my team, I would be happy to have a look at those. In the slide deck, it does just pick out a number of the key changes to the existing policy and proposed policy. And one of the key issues is always going to pick on the main element of the feedback is around naming streets after people. For good reason. A number of instances that I need to tell members about where there could be quite an embarrassment or reputational issue if we were to name a street after a person, and then obviously events come to light subsequently, particularly if you were arrested on those roads, etc. And your address is very important. It drives a lot of council services, it gets you post, and are actually quite difficult to change once it's done. So there's a change in that element of the policy. We're proposing to put number 13 back into the mix, because not every culture thinks 13 is unlucky.
I read something new to me. I think in my background, every student of 13. So what is your 13? I mean,
So, yeah, some people think 13 is unlucky.
but they still be used, so it can be unlucky, I mean, if it's used.
I'd say it might be lucky if you do. But no, I think something, basically, Chair, it's just kind of quashing, I think what you're calling an element of nonsense.
So what is your we're making something, we keep, not making it.
I think it's just, Chair, just being clear to members that it's the change between the existing policy and the new one. And like I say, just opening up a short opportunity, particularly new members who go onto the council may not pick this up. And if there's any kind of comments or concerns, then I'm just hoping that we're happy to.
Right.
Take
Members, okay. You have got any comments to make on the?
Not necessarily now, Chair, either. That's
Okay,
okay.
From me, even being here all the time, and even on the old body and the new body from boarding, there's very difference. I mean, this change 50 years, 25 years, for really see after the person sees person. But are there any exceptions to the current one? Because I don't want to openly say, well, I know recently, a couple of years ago, we have worked for public pathway, and I don't think it was pathway more than 25 years or 50 years. But in the name, the road street after.
Yeah, so there is. I think first we were trying to shift the number of years, particularly to pick up on communities of a non-white British heritage, to be honest, who, if you go back 50 years, as you'll appreciate, it actually cuts a large number of people from the community out of this process. And that was some of the feedback certainly we had from councillor Zappa in his response as a warm to the consultation. But just to answer your question, there is the details in the report. There is a process to effectively not adopt that approach, but a lot of that research, there's a lot of work that goes in to still do very quickly the analysis of that person, etc. So there is a way through it, but I'm certainly not encouraging a lot of use of that. That provision for upstanding, long-serving, aldermen or whoever the council, for instance, one example, or members of the community, with way around it.
Okay, certainly I think
In a logistical way.
we had some controversy, some road naming in Ferry Bar, which caused national controversy. So are we waiting for the government or any controversy in the future with the working box?
I know there was a slight controversy around some of the names. I think with different views. I'm trying to think what some of those names were now. Those names were subject to consultation at the time, and they were agreed as appropriate names. I think there's a view from elsewhere that perhaps, to use the terminology, they were slightly woke. That was some of the feedback I had after the consultation. But it's done, and they were consulted.
The other thing, this viewpoint, you need to be mindful of this sort of reaction. We don't put ourselves in prison with it.
But we also have some nuance, because I believe that is referring to the incident where Robert Jenrick, the then Housing and Community Secretary, criticised that those name choices, but they were chosen on the basis of feedback from residents, and they were road names like things like Hope Street or Conviction, or it was slightly abstract sounding street names, but they came at me of the consultation, and they were actually coming from the ground up. And I think that what was reported nationally was actually a caricature of what happens in Birmingham, because most places that I go, the road names are reflecting significant figures in Birmingham's history. And I think, but the point about that a 50-year time span before you can actually do that does cut out lots of different immigrant communities, isn't it? That I think communities like the Somali community, which really have become established in the city in the last 20 years, are we really saying that we're going to have to wait a half a century to be able to honour that, and they're making a contribution in our community. So I think
we went through that. So the member there can probably the feedback.
Either directly or sure.
Right, we need to move on to the next item. Are 10 places for people in Birmingham, Matt? Or we don't lead on it?
I'll be presenting. I'm assuming someone else is
Okay.
going to share the
Right.
slides, please. Is it this one?
If there's a one way to present, it's a math problem. Giving a brief could really report or presenting presented there. If you can just go find out.
Yes, there are some visuals that sort of help to illustrate what I need to say, but certainly I can kick off the introduction. So, at the request of the committee, we're going to talk about the Places for People programme in Birmingham. We try not to use the term low traffic neighbourhoods too much because it's become quite a sensitive subject, but actually that is a long established technical term. So I will start off just with a little bit of an introduction as to what a low traffic neighbourhood is in the interest, I think, of perhaps dispelling some of the myths that have perpetuated around this subject, particularly in more recent times. So a low traffic neighbourhood is just a catch-all term for the use of traffic management techniques such as modal filters, but also one-way streets and other types of closure or restriction to channel motorised traffic in particular ways around particularly residential areas, although we do see it in sort of town and city centres as well. The aim, of course, is to create safer and quieter places that are more conducive to active travel modes, such as walking and cycling, but they still do maintain access to the area for motor vehicles. So it's about reducing the speed and dominance of vehicular traffic in local areas where people live. Its origin actually comes from quite infamous within the transport world report, the Buchanan report published in 1963 called Traffic in Towns, which is actually sort of where a lot of the designs that we see in town and city centres actually comes from, and it's the idea of environmental area, which is somewhere that's free from external traffic. So it's very much from the same school of thought as a lot of the pedestrianisation that we're still sort of pushing for today. They've been used widely in the UK ever since sort of the mid-1960s. And actually, if you look at a lot of new housing estates, they're very much constructed on low traffic neighbourhood type principles. They're built that way in the first place, with sort of cul-de-sacs and cut-throughs for pedestrians and cyclists that can't be made by normal traffic. So if we could move on to the next slide. Okay. Computer's frozen. I'll carry on. There's some images to come that really, there should be some quite familiar pictures in terms of some of the locations in the city where we've been doing this thing. Historically, they've been very problem focused, so we've put in traffic management measures to address things like rat running and speeding. I can read what it says on the slide. Traffic and highway engineering is reflective of change in society, and with an increase in private motoring over the last 60 years, traffic management techniques have been increasingly used to to balance the impact of this on residential streets. And there we are. You can see some photographs there. These are not new schemes. These are things that have been in the city for really quite some time. And if the computer will allow, you can click onto the next one. We see them on minor side roads that front onto main arterial routes, especially where these have been converted to dual carriageways. And particularly in the last sort of couple of decades, we've got sat-navs, we've got travel apps. And they do increasingly reroute people off main routes through residential areas. We've also seen a growth in traffic in that time, and as such, the negative impacts of traffic on roads that are not intended to carry that volume of traffic is being increasingly seen. But I think as we sort of move forward, we are looking now to use low traffic neighbourhoods more proactively. So it's not just about countering the negative effects of traffic in residential areas. It's about trying to positively change those areas so that we're creating places that are more conducive to walking and cycling. So we can move on to the next. So text on there is very, very small. Sorry if you can't see that, but you've seen this in the papers again. So I'd say it's a shift away from preventing certain behaviours such as speeding and rat running, and towards positively encouraging behaviour change. So there was a bit of a resurgence around this type of technique in the early 2010s with the Hollands programme. Which was used in a number of the London boroughs, and Waltham Forest being perhaps the most well known of that. Based on Dutch concepts of classifying streets according to their use, we talk about link and place function. So whether a street is more about the activity in the place or whether it's about the traffic that's moving through it. So a motorway obviously has the highest link function and very little place. A residential street is much more about the place, but then the challenge you get is when we get our local centres that are on arterial routes, and it's both, and it's how you manage that. But it's all about classifying streets and then designing the street so that it's more suitable for that dominant use. So the term low traffic neighbourhood really is just London's living streets and their cycling campaigns. That was a term that they cloned. And at the same time, I think there was a recognition that low traffic neighbourhoods supported policy imperatives. I think we call them imperatives now rather than just objectives. So a range of social, environmental and economic factors, the climate emergency, benefits of active travel to physical and mental well-being. And also I think people starting to demand something different from the transport network and from the places that they actually live as well. And so the impact of the pandemic was very much about, we had curtailed public transport capacity, citizens needed more space for travel, and low traffic neighbourhoods actually became quite an important part of the toolkit during that time in terms of giving people outside space that they might not have, but also encouraging people to use active travel where public transport was suddenly a little bit more challenging. So just to flash up some key objectives of LTNs. This is what they're designed to do. We want to see a reduction in motor traffic across an area. We want to see a reduction in air pollution, a reduction in those short trips that Councillor Clements was talking about earlier. This figure is slightly out of date now, but certainly pre-pandemic, there were 250,000 car trips made every weekday in the city of Birmingham that are less than 1 mile in length. The vast majority of those focus around the school run, and that's very much the low-hanging fruit in terms of us actually encouraging those journeys that can be made by the roads. So then, of course, you get the consequential increase in walking and cycling, a reduction in collisions because there's less vehicular traffic in those areas, and then where trips are made by car, those trips are channeled onto the roads for which they are designed and managed for that purpose. So onto the main roads and onto the sort of the distributor network in any given local area. So we can move on. Excellent. So this brings us to the Birmingham Transport Plan, which Councillor Clements has already talked about, and also the COVID-19 response. So we published the draft Birmingham Transport Plan for consultation at the end of January 2020, just before the pandemic hit. Then in response to so that work was sort of paused while we sort of turned our hands to managing the impacts of the pandemic. But in response to that, the government made emergency active travel fund available to us, which was administered in West Midlands by the TFWM. in response to that, we created the Emergency Birmingham Transport Plan, which had very much the same core principles in it as the draft transport plan, but had a focus on keeping the city moving and keeping people active and able to get around when all of those restrictions were in place. And that really brought to the forefront things like low traffic neighbourhoods and the city segments project, as well as a number of pop-up cycle schemes. Then fast forward a couple of years, this was then superseded by the final Birmingham Transport Plan, which was adopted in October last year. But the final plan, I think, very much reflects a lot of the learning that we gained from delivery of the measures that were set out in the emergency transport plan. And I think it's just worth pointing out there that these type of schemes are now a fundamental component of the Birmingham Transport Plan, and they will need to be delivered to support the behaviour change that we need to see to tackle the climate emergency and those other economic, environmental and social imperatives. So very much starting to see this embedded in policy. But trying to move away from some of the negativity around low traffic neighbourhoods. The Places for People programme is what we started to call this in the city. It's very much about giving residential streets back to the people that live in them. So we saw investment through Emergency Active Travel Fund in the pilot low traffic neighbourhood schemes in Kilkee, Gazelles, Bourneville and Castle Vale. They were deployed using experimental traffic regulation orders. So an experimental traffic regulation order means that rather than having to do a lot of engagement before the scheme goes in, a normal traffic regulation order has a period of statutory consultation that's required before that can happen. An experimental order is the same as a permanent order, except the engagement runs for the first 6 months. So it allows you to actually put in a scheme and for people to comment on what the actual impacts are rather than just a perception of what might happen. So that engagement is open for the first 6 months, and then any time between the end of that 6 months and a further 12 months, the order either has to be made permanent or it has to be revoked. So if you're using an experimental traffic regulation order, the consultation is effectively embedded into that. Is embedded into that process. It's intended to be that way. But that said, we did do some engagement before implementing the experimental traffic regulations order. That experimental traffic regulation that engagement took place mostly online due to COVID restrictions and had to be done quite quickly due to the timescales set by government for actually implementing a lot of these schemes. The Kings Heath and Moseley scheme in particular proved controversial. There were a number of concerns from the community expressed, some around the process, others around perceptions about displaced traffic and vehicle volumes and speeds. So this led to some additional engagement and monitoring that we did in that area. A member board was established for that scheme to help steer the way forward. An action plan was implemented to provide some short-term mitigations to the impacts that have been identified as part of the scheme. And we also commissioned a wider traffic study to inform future scheme development and mitigations for a scheme at a later phase. But I think the issues that were highlighted through the engagement that we did in advance of implementing were quite consistent across the areas. There was a consensus view that residential areas were dominated by the volume and speed of vehicular traffic, and that this was a barrier to active travel, but also to other uses of the street as well. So kids playing out, community cohesion, people getting to know their neighbours, and that sort of thing. So there was a consensus about the fact that traffic was a problem, where the consensus was not so clear, was about what we should do in order to tackle that. So we then move on to the Active Travel Fund Tranche 2 programme, which was the next release of funding from government. The City Council bid into this process to expand the Places for People programme. And we've got 2 Places for People projects that remain in the Active Travel Fund programme. That's the Kings Heath and Moseley and the Lizelle schemes. The Bourneville scheme, which was originally part of Active Travel Fund, we're still proceeding with that, but that's actually just part of the Transportation Highways Capital Programme. That's no longer being funded through the Active Travel Fund programme. So having got these pilot schemes out on the network, we undertook a further round of engagement. We engaged in Lizelle's in late 2021. We're now doing some detailed design work to expand that scheme, and that will be expanded in the next few months via an experimental traffic regulation order. In Kings Heath, the consultation there was also during autumn last year, and we've subsequently developed a new concept design responding to the issues that were raised by the community during that consultation. And there is further localised engagement due to take place on elements of that revised scheme, which will take place in September, and subject to approval by Cabinet for that particular scheme, owing to the controversial history there. That will also be expanded in the early part of next year with an experimental traffic regulation. Now, up on the screen there, you can see there is the graph. That's just sort of the headline results from the consultation. We've already highlighted that these schemes proved controversial, both in terms of the speed of the initial implementation and people not understanding the process and feeling like they weren't, that it was being imposed upon them, but also the perceived impacts of some of the interventions around displaced traffic and the like. These results have already been widely reported and discussed, and we weren't going to sort of have a further post-mortem of those results today, but I just wanted to put this graph in there to show you how there is that polarity in views. Yes, there is a significant proportion of people that are opposed to the scheme, but if you actually look at the other side of the graph, there is a not insignificant proportion of people that are actually quite strongly supportive of the scheme. And so for us, a key focus now is not to treat the consultation as a yes or no, but to explore in much more detail the reasons that people aren't supportive of that, and to bring forward a scheme that actually addresses the reasons that they're not supporting. So in all 3 of those pilot schemes, the experimental traffic regulation order measures have now been made permanent and sealed in permanent orders. And the Cabinet member report endorsed the way forward in Kings Heath and Moseley, and was subject to reporting to this committee previously. Bourneville is slightly further behind in the process, but some engagement is due to take place on them in the next few months. So that's where we are. We've got the original schemes that we're in; they've now been made permanent, and we're in the process of further expanding on the schemes through the next phase of funding. So as the programme evolved, we had an increased focus on what the desired outcomes were and how we measured success. I think a key concern has been about equity, the perception from the pilot schemes that there were some winners and losers. And I think it's important for us to recognise that making it better for some people should not be at the expense of others. But there is a need to balance this against the different functions of different roads, as we talked about, this Lincoln Place concept. And actually, it wouldn't be reasonable to expect us to be able to create the same quality of environment on a major A road than you could in a residential cul-de-sac, because these roads have a very different function. But that's not to say, but we still can't be making things any more challenging for these parts of the network that already experience congestion. So that's why we've got these indicators such as reducing motorised traffic within the LTN, but having congestion being neutral on the boundary roads. If we make congestion worse on the outside of the low traffic neighbourhood, we've actually sort of not achieved what we're trying to achieve. And I think the other key point here is to talk about things happening over time. You will note that a lot of those indicators that are listed there on the screen talk about change over time, and that's because it can take some time for the benefits of schemes like this to bed in. People don't change their behaviour overnight. It can take a period of several months for the actual behaviour change to take place and those benefits to be realised.
Madam, can I ask you to skip the?
Yeah, well, almost at the end now. Yeah.
Complete.
So, in terms of data and monitoring, this has been a sort of a key point in this. A key issue for the original schemes was the lack of baseline data because the schemes were developed so rapidly, but subsequently we have been able to undertake much more data collection and to create a good baseline for any further changes to the schemes that go forward. So making use of existing traffic data as well as additional local traffic counts. We would make a point, there's been a lot of questions about traffic modelling. I think it's important to recognise that these traffic models, they're not an absolute. You can't put something through a traffic model and get a definite answer as to the result from that, and that would be replicated on ground. So we use these to give us a flavour and to forecast any significant likely issues of displacement and things like that. But because there are so many complex factors, use of traffic models is not always the right approach to take with LTN schemes. Okay, the next slide, please. Air quality monitoring, it seems to be quite a common theme from this afternoon's presentations. Just to show there really that those green dots that you can see, those are all the sites where we're monitoring air quality in and around King's Heath, so that we've got a picture of the impact of the low traffic neighbourhood on air quality. At the moment, the air quality in this area is considered to be stable and below levels of concern. So we're confident that the low traffic neighbourhood schemes that have gone in so far have not had a detrimental impact on air quality. Actually, the advice from the experts on this was that the low traffic neighbourhood schemes would be unlikely to have any impact on air quality. But because it's such a concern to the community, we are monitoring it anyway, just so that we can be absolutely transparent about what the impacts are. On the next slide, this is probably one of the more interesting things to draw out this afternoon. So these heat maps show indicative changes in traffic between April 2018 and April 2021. What this does is highlight some of the changes in traffic patterns from the first phase of the LTN project. So this data comes from INRIX, which uses information from sat-navs to understand traffic patterns. We then did some clever stuff with the data to show the relative traffic volumes on each of those roads for the entire month of April. So you can't, the roads there aren't labelled, but I think the key message from it, you can see the A435 running there north-south, and then the road that runs sort of diagonally up on that right-hand corner, that's Vicarage Road there. So you can see there that whilst there are some changes in the shading, overall the roads that were busy before the schemes went in are the same roads that were busy after, but you can see a reduction within the low traffic neighbourhood areas in those colours. So the roads are getting quieter within the LTN, but on the boundary roads, they're not actually getting any busier than they were before. But this is only indicative.
it only gives you a flavour. It represents quite a small sample of traffic that has a GPS box in it, and it is potentially weighted in favour of commercial vehicles as well. So I think probably the next steps we can skip past because we've already covered that, but I did just want to conclude with a few lessons learned so far. So although the pandemic created urgency, these type of schemes take a great deal of time and effort to deliver, and I think even the Department of Transport has now recognised that the ask that was put to local authorities to deliver these schemes of this type in those timelines was completely unreasonable. And never again would we try to do anything like this so rapidly. Technical assessments such as data collection and modelling are important, but also is articulating the narrative to win hearts and minds as to why we're doing this in the first place. And as I say, the data and the modelling will only ever give you a flavour of what it is that's going to happen. The local geography and the layout of the road network influences the size of the area that you treat and the cells within, so there's no kind of standard approach to doing this. It really does depend on the nature of the local roads as to where you might want to filter and where you might want to put your boundaries, but also that doing measures in isolation, as was the case in School Road, might not achieve the desired outcome. It's likely to just move the traffic onto the next road, onto the next road over. There is no scheme design or approach to doing this that will satisfy everyone, but equally doing nothing won't satisfy everyone either. So this is always going to be a challenge. Change can be difficult, it can be challenging and uncomfortable for some people. Generally, there is support for the vision for lower traffic, and less speed and less dominance of traffic in local neighbourhoods. I said that the flavour that we got from the engagement was lots of people think there is too much traffic and it drives too fast on their roads. That doesn't necessarily translate into support for the schemes that we need to make that change. It's the same thing with public transport. Everybody wants the buses to be on time and reliable, but if we start reallocating road space towards bus lanes, that very often causes controversy. So people are bought into the vision, but they don't want to accept the things that need to happen to actually make those changes and realise that clear vision. And linked to that, if people aren't willing to change their behaviours, it's very difficult to harness the scheme benefits. The benefits of places for people schemes come when people realise that the roads are safer to walk and cycle than they were before, and they stop driving, and you get that virtuous circle effect. But we need something to trigger that. The behaviour change that is so fundamental won't happen overnight. It takes time for people to recognise that there is a change, to adapt their behaviour, and actually some people can go through quite an extended process before they accept these schemes, even if they still don't agree with it. And finally, I'm sure I've already baffled you further with traffic regulation orders and the difference between a normal traffic regulation order and an experimental one. The public really don't understand that process, and I think that was actually a huge barrier to what we were trying to do, and actually getting people to understand that we put this in as an experiment. You've got 6 months to tell us what you think based on your lived experience of it, not on your perception of it. And we're not doing this without consultation at all. Those processes run in parallel, and I think the better we can have members and citizens understanding that process, the more trust there will be in us using them going forward.
Thank you, Ryan. Right. I think it's very comparable to what we're talking, and I really got a lot of this topic to give more time, best in the future meetings. But now, are there any questions now?
Can I just ask, sorry, a couple of quick questions? Forgive my ignorance on this, but you've got the low traffic management schemes and you've got things like car-free school streets. So how do these two schemes work kind of in tandem? some schools more suitable to one scheme as opposed to another? Is a car-free school street scheme presumably less expensive because there's less infrastructure changes and can be as effective? And also, just another quick question, is just the next step, just so I understand, are you looking to potentially roll this out further across the whole of Birmingham? How's that going to be developed over the next year or two? And how does the consultation go and how do you decide which areas should be chosen?
So, car-free school streets and places for people schemes are very much out of the same mould, and I think as we deliver more of these schemes and we evolve the programme, there would be, if there is a school within an area for a low traffic neighbourhood, it would be very sensible to include proposals for a car-free school street at the same time. I think the key distinction is in a low traffic neighbourhood scheme or places for people scheme, there is nowhere that's not accessible by private vehicle. It's just the route that you take to get there that might be different, and it's probably it may well be less direct than it was. So public transport, walking and cycling have unrestricted access through any point. If you're in a car, you might have to drive the long way round effectively. The difference with a car-free school street is that road is actually closed, and we don't want people to drive within that area at all during that 30 minutes or so at either side of the school, day. That's not to say that people can't and don't drive up to the boundary of the car-free school street scheme, but at least you've dispersed the problem away from the school gate, and you've encouraged the children to have that last part of their journey made by active travel. So they're related components out of the same toolbox. I would also put 20-mile-an-hour limits in that same toolkit, and potentially residential parking schemes or further controlled parking zone expansion as well. They're all things that we've got in our toolbox designed to support the key principle in the Birmingham Transport Plan around encouraging active travel in local neighbourhoods. And the first step to that has got to be to reduce the speed and volume of vehicular private motorised traffic in residential areas. And if you do that first, you may not need to build lots of special infrastructure. You might not need, if there's less cars and the cars that were there were travelling more slowly, you don't need a segregated cycle infrastructure. You don't need as many controlled pedestrian crossings because the environment is managed in a different way. So it's about de-trafficking and slowing down the speeds first, and then bringing in other measures thereafter. But in line with the principle in the Birmingham Transport Plan, we would expect to see this rolled out across other areas in the city. Obviously, this is all subject to funding, but there are a number of local programmes. The local road safety programme, the local cycling and walking safe routes to school that can be used collectively to deliver these type of schemes. And the Birmingham Transport Plan delivery plan that was also mentioned earlier by Councillor Clements will start to put more detail on what those schemes might look like and what the timeline for bringing this forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to add on to what Mel has just said, and again, if I get this wrong, please do correct me. But with car-free schools, one major difference that I don't think you mentioned is the use of permits. So the residents have permits, and if it's a cul-de-sac, they can get out during a half an hour a day, and school teachers and other support staff at school who need to travel into that also have a permit as well. So it's not a bespoke approach. The permit scheme actually gives us flexibility, which is absolutely essential both for the employees of the school but also for residents of the cul-de-sac. So it's, as Mel said, it's a whole toolbox. The one thing I was disappointed not to see is that I know there's been various petitions about the neighbourhoods. for example, my colleague was Higgs from IC submitted a huge petition, and it's not reflected from his residents of IC board, not reflected in evaluation, consultation, feedback, that sort of thing. So that is a different aspect to it. And of course, you can do class 3 schools within safe route to school schemes. I think there's we're doing one at the moment. Yes, it is actually, yes. But I was going to mention that, but thank you for mentioning it. Yes, I'd like to see as fast as 20 miles per hour. It is like a whole toolbox. And in terms of going forward, I believe we are proposing another LTN in Holyhead Ward, because it was one of the schemes in the Highways local improvement budget from the council papers that council tenants referred to earlier. Certainly that's the description. And finally, I was going to say, I lost my final point.
So, sorry, you ready? So, could you read briefly then?
I'm not sure there were that many questions in there, actually.
I don't think
It's mostly.
I think they're observations.
Yes, you're right about the permits. Obviously, we need to allow people to get into and out of their properties. And that's actually been one of the big strengths of the Carfree School Streets scheme. It's how we manage the impact of the school run journeys, but without being to the detriment of the residents, many of which suffer not being able to get out of their drives anyway. So having to have a permit is a vast improvement. Can you explain further what the petition?
As councillors, we can submit petitions to council. I believe Councillor Adams submitted a quite substantial petition from residents of his ward in relation to the LTNs. And it's a question of tying everything up. Because I wouldn't like to think you present a petition and it goes into the ether. I would like that, someone actually looks at this and responds back and actually acknowledges it as part of the process.
If a petition is submitted, then it is responded to.
But it's not reflected anywhere in this documentation.
It's not represented anywhere in this documentation.
Yes.
Neither is a number of other petitions that we received, because we didn't really want to have too much of a post-mortem today around the consultation results. That has had a line drawn under that in terms of the cabinet report, the cabinet member report that was approved last year. But if a petition is submitted, it would always be reflected in the appropriate reporting. So when we reported on the results of the consultation, we might not add all of those signatures into the negative total because the question wasn't asked in the same way. But it would absolutely be included in the report to say X number of petitions were received, totaling so many resident signatures, or whatever was appropriate to be done. So it's not included here today. It's because we didn't think it was that one particular petition not directly relevant to what's being said here, but it will have been recorded where it is supposed to be. And the Holyhead Ward LTN, I think we are aware of issues in that area that need a scheme to address them. Whether it's a low traffic neighbourhood, whether it's traffic calming, whether it's a series of one-way streets, whether it's a parking scheme, I think that needs to be looked at. And I think it's very important that we have the community come to us with their issues, and officers recommend what the best scheme way forward for that is. And we very often get petitioned for things like, I want a low traffic neighbourhood, and it's just like, well, actually, no, you want us to address this issue, and the best way to address this issue is this. So there is a scheme in that programme which will address the issues in that area. Whether it's a low traffic neighbourhood or something else is to be determined.
Okay, after the details covered, did you see you had? Will you make any comments?
No, it's just every week I get a briefing on petitions that have been submitted, so
Okay,
that's a
yeah.
major part of, the I just wanted to reassure everybody that if you submit a petition on behalf of your residents, it will be considered seriously. But I mean, a number of us are frustrated by petitions that we submitted that didn't go anywhere. For example, I spent a lot of time collecting signatures in support of the bus lane on the A38, alongside a competing petition which gained more signatures against it. So, and I think that's actually part of our role as local politicians, to be that channel for local opinion, isn't it? But none of these things are a sort of referendum.
That's simply and did so that not fully we are just one week now.
Yeah, I've got a few. So just I wanted to a few points to clarify, I think probably more than anything. So we've used and so just so I can get my head around it, so the experimental traffic regulation orders were used, and that was primarily because it had to be all done quite quickly, and we're going to be using them going forward or keeping them because you think that it's better to have the consultation and actually in place in the consultation at the same time. Is that right? And in terms of, I guess, for Mosaic Heath LTN, there is a point where, and it might be that it's in the report and I haven't got it or I haven't looked at it. So we're at the point where it's a design review process. What exactly does that mean? And if it's a consultation, is it, just so I'm clear on these, is it that you only consult, you don't necessarily just consult with the residents within the LTN, but those outside it as well? And there was only one point just of note, and it's kind of a new councillor, but I'm just finding it really confusing that there are quite a few different schemes, and is it the idea that is there somebody taking overall control of all of these? Because I'm just hearing about lots of different names, different schemes that do different things in terms of traffic management, and it gets really confusing then as a councillor or anyone else trying to work out, well, what scheme do I apply to do what? And is there somebody that does a kind of oversee them all?
I think a number of us are aware of the time, Chair.
Sorry, yeah.
Because of that, just because we've got the battle relay stuff. But I suppose the purpose, the way it's fitted together nicely, because the present portfolio presentation was to try and raise awareness of Birmingham Transport Plan. That is the conceptual framework that we're looking for. It's all so Mel's name checks a number of schemes, but they will fill in that drive on an active travel and what we're doing at level.
So if you want me to the rest of the questions. Experimental traffic regulation orders. The guidance on those regulations that it's set out in law.
Yeah.
Speed is not a justification for using an experimental traffic. You can't use an experimental traffic regulation order just because you haven't got time to consult before you put it in. An experimental traffic regulation order is when it's experimental. It's when you're doing something and you don't know for certain what the impacts are going to be. So it is for experimental schemes. It's to allow something to be tried and tested to see if it works, and so that people can comment on what actually happens rather than what they think might happen. It does have the advantage of being a little bit quicker, but ultimately the process of sealing it and making it into a permanent order is exactly the same. Normally what we would do is we do an informal consultation to flush out any likely objections. Then we bring forward the statutory consultation on the traffic regulation order. If there's no objections, we proceed. If there are objections, they have to be reviewed and either the scheme tweaked, or we do have the powers to overrule those objections if they're not if they're not a good enough reason to not do the scheme. The works happen, it's all audited to make sure it's as it should be, and then the order is sealed and it comes into effect. So at some point, whether it's an experimental order or a normal order, those processes do align. And if people submit material objections to that traffic order in the first 6 months, then we have to consider that in exactly the same way as if we'd have done it using the other process. So an objection that is on appropriate grounds can't just be dismissed. You can't object to a traffic regulation order just because you don't know it. You can't object on a kind of principle. But if you're a business that will no longer be able to load at your premises, you can object for example.
Right, okay, I think we can conclude this item here. I know that there is not more questions, and we probably have going back to the meeting. That's what questions is. Our second members, it is good that they want some further on this, and then you can ask them. Okay.
I think we're more than happy to answer questions offline, but I think as these schemes evolve, we'd be more than happy to bring back further updates as to how things are progressing, because I think perhaps a lot of the things you really want to know, we won't know until we've gone a bit further down that.
We want to have a child again in the future then. Thank you. Right, we move on to the next, and that's the workflow.
Yeah, so conscious of time, so I wanted to introduce the committee to the work programme report with its appendix. The appendix itself outlines the detail of what has been currently scheduled for each of the meetings for the rest of the municipal year. And in addition, at the end of that appendix, you will see a list of items that were identified at the informal session, which are yet to be scheduled. One update on that is that we have had a timing over the first one, which was the re-procurement of the highways K5 contract, which I'm looking at SEMA, but I think it's been scheduled for November. And the last one you will see there, number 8, which is the flood risk management annual report. We're looking around to use similar timescale as what's been used in previous years, and to look at that around March. So we're still getting timescales on the others, and they will be slotted into the work programme for future meetings. So as I said, I wanted to introduce this to you. It is a dynamic document. It's a living document. It will be updated and presented to you for every committee. What is important that we reflect on, and we can do this both here and we can do it at some meetings to ensure there is nothing missing. Things can be added on, things can be taken away, but also to note this is an document to inform both yourselves what's happening, but also officers to prepare effectively for the meetings. They're really clear on the aims and objectives of the specific items. So again, any information as members you can provide around that would be really, really helpful.
Thank you, Member. I'm just looking at the forward plan, which I think comes under this item agenda. And on page 3 of the forward plan, which I think is page 57, we've got reference 010280 2022, capital bid for the introduction of car parking across selected BCC parks. Is this a capital bid for the introduction of car parking across selected BCC parks, or is this a capital bid for the introduction of car parking charges across selected BCC parks?
Through you, Chair, I'll ask Kevin Hicks that question. I'm saying it's very much a city ops. I think he's gone.
Yeah, Kevin had to leave the meeting.
Yeah, it's certainly not something I'm taking forward in my department. We'll get you a correct answer rather than perhaps
I think that's a crucial difference.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
You want to get a response to?
Yeah, the responses, I'll speak to Kevin Hicks and we'll an answer to Councillor Constable and also the committee.
To the meeting entity, yeah. Right. But anything else?
No, nothing further.
Right, we move on to the item 12, proposed dates of meetings for autumn. Can I get approval to approve it? Yeah.
Agreed.
Third is practical calling. I don't have any calling. Any particulars?
Not yet.
No. Okay. Any other business? Business?
No.
Okay. On the 15th for the game event
Agreed.
at Birmingham office there.
We just to clarify, that's in a different portfolio now, it's in council and municipal plan, but we'll relay on the request for.
The reason is I still think it comes to the scrutiny committee.
Oh, yeah, it's in your committee, but not mine.
Thank you very much for your attendance and this concludes the meeting. And look forward to seeing you again. Okay? Thank you.
That's great.
Shifting the blame already now.
Yes. Everyone just a reminder, that it's still recording.
Thank you.
That's fine.